In 1986, a Japanese diver named Kihachiro Aratake was conducting a routine dive off Yonaguni Island in southern Japan. His goal was to search for hammerhead sharks, something he had done many times before, but this time he found something far more remarkable than he had expected: a perfectly constructed staircase. These weren't just a few steps, they were a full staircase carved into the rock, leading down into the darkness. If I were to witness this today, I'd probably think I'd found the abyss. But this structure wasn't just made up of stairs. At the end of the staircase, there were walls, platforms, and something resembling a path. Aratake, filled with mixed emotions, immediately surfaced and told people what he'd seen. But of course, no one believed him. After all, who would believe there was a city in the middle of the ocean? Seeing Aratake so adamant about what he'd seen, other divers decided to go down and take a look. And what they saw was exactly as Aratake had described. And so began the debate that has persisted since 1986. Was there an ancient city in the middle of the ocean, or had the fish taken up construction work? All of this is a question, and tonight we're diving deep into the subject. To understand what truly lies at the bottom of the dark water, we must leave the ocean behind and go back to the very beginning. Good evening and welcome back to History for Sleep. I am an absolute history enthusiast, and I am just as fascinated by the blank spaces and the unsolved anomalies of our past as you are. Usually we look at documented events, but tonight we are stepping into one of those blank spaces, into a different kind of mystery. But before we go there, as always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Also, if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let your shoulders soften and your jaw unclench. Let your breathing slow down. Let your mind wander through the mysterious corridors of history. Let's begin. Before we delve into the mystery of this underwater city, there is one name we absolutely must mention: Augustus Lee Plongeon. He is the central figure in this mystery. Augustus Lee Plongeon was born in 1825 on the island of Jersey, located off the western coast of France. By the time he reached his 40s, he had already lived many different lives. He ran a photography studio in San Francisco, worked as a land surveyor in Chile, and practiced medicine in Lima, Peru. All of this provided him with valuable experience. Additionally, while living in Peru, he had the opportunity to examine the ruins of the Inca civilization and photograph them. Until then, no one had examined these ruins in such detail, and this gave him the feeling that he had discovered something. Perhaps this is why he would eventually become involved in the mystery of the Mu. By 1873, the Plongeon had turned his attention to the Maya ruins at Chichen Itza and Uxmal in Mexico. He set sail for Mexico with his wife Alice Dixon, and they lived there for a full 12 years. There they conducted an extremely professional study. The number of photographs Alice took during those years exceeds 500, and these images are still preserved in archives today. Later researchers interested in the subject have regarded them as an invaluable treasure and truly significant. But things get interesting from this point on. Because Le Plongeon did not merely document the Maya, he also interpreted them, and his interpretations were somewhat different from what was customary. By 1876, Le Plongeon had begun working at a mound near the platform of the Eagles and Jaguars. It wasn't long before he made a discovery, a stone statue. The statue lay on its side, its head turned at a certain angle, and its belly was flat. Le Plongeon named this statue Chacmo. In the Maya language, this name means red great jaguar. However, there are rumors that the name was directly inspired by the puma. The name also belonged to an ancient Maya prince who had passed away fighting for the queen. Le Plongeon claimed that this prince's story was rooted in ancient Egypt, and that the Maya were actually the ones who founded Egypt. The academic community of that era had firmly rejected this claim. At the time, Stephen Salisbury, Jr. of the American Antiquarian Society had supported Le Plongeon on many issues and valued his ideas. However, when Le Plongeon sent him the Chacmo theory in 1879, even Salisbury struggled to defend it. But Le Plongeon was not a man to give up easily. He shifted his research to the Troano manuscript and began his investigation. Eventually he would find what he was looking for. But to understand this part, we need to know what the Troano manuscript is. The Troano manuscript is one of 4 surviving manuscripts from the 16th century, dating from after the Spanish arrival in the American continent. And then he found something in the Troano Codex. The Troano Codex is a genuine Maya manuscript, one of only 4 that survived the Spanish arrival in the Americas in the 16th century. It is now held at the Museo de America in Madrid, and it dates to sometime between 900 and 1521 AD. And it is a real historical document, and scholars have been studying it for a very long time. Le Plongeon looked at the Troano Codex, and he read something in it that nobody else had read. He said it described the collapse of a land called Mu, a land that had sunk beneath the ocean. He said the text read something like this. He said it described how the land of Mu was hit by earthquakes and volcanic fire, and how it sank in a single night, where 64 million stories quietly faded into history. Now here is the problem with that. Every single scholar who has looked at Le Plongeon's translation since 1876 has concluded that it is wrong, and not just a little wrong, but completely wrong. And the consensus today among Maya scholars is that the Troano Codex is actually an astrological almanac dealing with rituals connected to the rain deity Chak, and that it has nothing whatsoever to do with sunken continents. Cyrus Thomas, who was working for the Bureau of American Ethnology in the 1880s, reviewed Le Plongeon's translation and described it in an 1882 report as not only unsupported by any evidence, but contradicted by the text itself. And yet, Le Plongeon did not stop. He published a book called Queen Mu and the Egyptian Sphinx in 1896, in which he argued at length that a Maya queen named Mu had escaped the collapse of Mu and sailed to Egypt and become the Isis of Egyptian mythology, and that the Sphinx at Giza was actually built in her honor. The book was not well received. A 1909 review by Channing Arnold and Frederick Frost called Le Plongeon's Ideas on Maya Diffusion, and I am quoting here the most remarkable of all theories, and they said his proposition that Central American civilization, dated back 11,500 years, was received with what they called Homeric laughter. Le Plongeon spent the last years of his life in Brooklyn, New York, writing and defending himself against people who said his work was fantasy, and he passed away there in 1908 at the age of 83, with his theories rejected by essentially every professional archaeologist alive. And that should have been the end of Mu. But it was not, because a few years before Le Plongeon passed away, he had started meeting with a British man named James Churchward, and those Sunday afternoon meetings in New York would change everything. James Churchward was born in England in 1851, or possibly 1852. The records are not entirely clear, and he liked to be called Colonel Churchward, though there is some debate about whether he ever actually held that rank. And by the time he arrived in Le Plongeon's circle in the 1890s, he had already developed his own ideas about lost civilizations. But Churchward's story actually starts much earlier than that. Churchward claimed that in the 1860s, when he was a young man, he had been stationed in India with the British Army during a severe hardship, and that while he was there, he had been befriended by a Hindu priest at a monastery in western Tibet, who was one of only 3 people in the entire world who could read an ancient language called Nakal. Now, Nakal, according to Churchward, was the original language of all humanity. The priest taught Churchward to read Nakal, and then showed him a set of ancient clay tablets hidden in the monastery, and on those tablets, Churchward said, was the complete history of a lost civilization in the Pacific Ocean. He called it Mu. Churchward said Mu was enormous, a continent stretching 5,000 miles from east to west, and more than 3,000 miles from north to south, which would have made it larger than South America. And he said it had been home to 64 million people, living across 7 major cities, under one government and one religion, and that its people, the Nakal people, had been technologically advanced in ways that even the modern world had not fully matched. He said Mu had been lifted above sea level in the first place by the expansion of underground volcanic gases, and that around 12,000 years ago those same gases collapsed and the entire continent sank into the Pacific Ocean in a matter of days. The survivors, he said, scattered across the earth and founded every major civilization, from India to Egypt, to the Maya, to the Polynesian islands. And that was why all those ancient cultures had similar symbols, similar stories, similar beliefs, because they all came from the same place. It is a compelling story, but there is a problem. Nobody ever saw the Nakal tablets. Not one person, other than Churchward himself, ever claimed to have seen them or read them or verified their existence. And when researchers later tried to locate them or find any independent record of a Nakal language or a Nakal brotherhood, the trail went cold every single time. The New York Times in April 1933 published a piece about Churchward that said, and this is worth reading carefully, it said, Mr. Churchward is an authority, the only authority there is on the lost continent of Mu. It is in fact his continent by all the rights there are of discovery. The only authority there is. One man, one set of tablets that nobody else saw, one language that nobody else could verify. Churchward published his first book, The Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Man, in 1926, when he was 74 years old, and it sold well. and he followed it with the Children of Mu in 1931, and the Sacred Symbols of Mu in 1933, and Cosmic Forces of Mu in 1934. And by the end of his life, he had spent what he claimed was 50 years researching this civilization that existed only in those tablets that nobody else could find. James Churchward passed away in 1936 at the age of 84. And here is the thing, the story did not fade with him. So you have two men, Lee Plongeon and Churchward. And between them they built something that has lasted more than 150 years. And the question worth asking is why? Why does a theory this thin, this unsupported, this thoroughly rejected by every geologist and archaeologist and linguist who has ever looked at it, why does it keep going? And the answer to that question starts not in the Pacific Ocean, but on a small island in the Mediterranean in 360 BC, because Mu is not the first lost continent. Plato wrote about Atlantis in two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, in 360 BC, and he described it as a powerful naval empire that had existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is what the Greeks called the Strait of Gibraltar, and he said it had sunk into the ocean in a single day and night. Most classical scholars today believe Plato invented Atlantis as a literary device to make a philosophical point about the dangers of greed and imperial overreach, and that he never intended it to be taken as a literal historical account. But people have been looking for Atlantis for 2,000 years. And when Lee Plongeon came along in the 1870s with his Maya translation and his sunken land of Mu, he was not inventing something new. He was plugging into a very old human habit, the habit of believing that somewhere out there beneath the water there is a civilization we have lost, and that if we could find it, we would understand something important about where we came from. Churchward understood this, and he used it, and the books sold. Before we continue, there is one more thing you absolutely must know about James Churchward. In 1933, the New York Times published an article about him. The article stated that Mr. Churchward is the sole authority on the lost continent of Mu. In terms of discovery rights, this continent actually belongs entirely to him. It is his continent. One man, one story, and tablets no one else in the world had seen. That same year, Churchward had written and sold so many books that publishers were struggling to keep up, and readers were buying them non-stop. Actually, this is quite normal. Imagine if the same thing happened today, it would likely spark major debates on social media. But the real question was, how had the lost continent of Mu become one of the most debated alternative history theories of the early 20th century? How did this story, which lacked any definitive sources, scientific backing, or proof, reach the masses and convince people of its truth? To understand this, we must go back to India in the 1860s. It was 1868. A young soldier named Churchward entered a temple one day and claimed that the person he met there changed his life. Churchward described this man in the finest detail. The man, who spoke of a language called Nakal, claimed to know a great deal. He said that only 3 people remained who knew this language, and that he was one of them. So where was this language spoken? Where did it belong? You know the answer. It belonged to Mu, and he claimed that this language was the ancestor of all languages. According to Churchward's claims, the priest he met at this monastery began teaching him the Knuckle language, a process that would take months. And perhaps the most important part is that he said the priest had him read the written tablets kept in a secret area in the monastery's basement. There's no such thing as an oral source, but if there's a written source, that's what really makes a splash. It could even change the world. So what was written on these tablets? The words of God, magical garments, Solomon's ring. None of those were there. According to Churchward, these tablets contained the complete history of civilizations that had reigned for over 50,000 years before the collapse of Mu 12,000 years ago. 64 million people, he said. 7 great cities, a single government, a single religion. As a writer, I must say that the last option seems far more magnificent than all the others. A continent larger than South America, sitting in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, stretching from Hawaii in the north, down to Easter Island and Fiji in the south, and from the Mariana Islands in the west, all the way toward the coast of the Americas in the east. And he said the Knuckle people of Mu were not primitive. They were advanced in ways that the modern world had not caught up with, and that their science and their spiritual knowledge had been the foundation for every civilization that came after them. India, Babylon, Egypt, Persia, the Maya, the Polynesian Islanders, the Aboriginals of Australia. All of them, according to Churchward, were descended from survivors of Mu who had carried pieces of that original culture with them when they departed this submerging continent. It is a grand unified theory of human civilization, and the problem is that not one piece of physical evidence for any of it has ever been found. But Churchward did not rely only on the Knuckle tablets. In the early 1920s, an American geologist named William Niven was excavating sites near San Miguel Amantla in Mexico, and between 1921 and 1923, Niven dug up around 2,500 stone tablets with symbols on them, and he was not sure what to make of them, and he published his findings. Churchward got hold of Niven's work and announced that the Mexican tablets said exactly the same thing as the Knuckle tablets he had seen in India 50 years earlier. This was a significant claim. Niven's tablets were real physical objects that had been dug out of the ground by a credentialed geologist, and if Churchward's reading of them was correct, it would have been genuine corroborating evidence. But here is the problem with that. Niven himself never said his tablets had anything to do with a lost Pacific civilization, and the symbols on the Niven tablets have since been examined by multiple researchers, and none of them have found any connection to Churchward's Knuckle script or to any known writing system from the Pacific region. William Niven passed away in 1937 and left no endorsement of Churchward's interpretation. So Churchward had 2 sets of tablets, and he was the only person who could read either of them. Now, at this point, you might be asking a reasonable question. You might be asking, why did anyone believe this? And the answer to that is more interesting than you might expect. In the 1920s and 1930s, the world was changing very fast, and the things that science was discovering were genuinely strange and destabilizing. In 1922, Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's resting place in Egypt, and the entire Western world became briefly obsessed with the idea that ancient civilizations had known things that modern people had forgotten. In 1926, the year Churchward published his first Mu book, A Norwegian researcher named Anton Wilhelm Bragger published work suggesting that Polynesian cultures had connections to South American peoples, and the question of how ancient people had crossed vast oceans was genuinely open and genuinely debated among serious scholars. And in 1929 a map was discovered in Istanbul, a map drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, and that map showed what appeared to be Antarctica, 300 years before Antarctica was officially discovered, and researchers argued about what that meant for decades. The world in the late 1920s and early 1930s felt like a place where the official story of human history might be missing some very large chapters. Churchward's Moo landed in that moment, and it landed hard. His first book went through multiple printings, and he followed it with 4 more, and he lectured and he gave interviews, and he became, if not exactly a respected figure, then at least a famous one. And when the New York Times called Moo his continent, they did not mean it as an insult. They meant it as a fact, because nobody else was claiming it. But there is another layer to this story that does not get talked about enough. Augustus Le Plongeon, the man who first pulled the word moo out of the Troano Codex in 1876, spent the last 30 years of his life watching his ideas get rejected and ridiculed. And he passed away in Brooklyn in 1908, having never convinced a single mainstream archaeologist that he was right. Churchward knew Le Plongeon personally. They had met in New York in the 1890s at those Sunday afternoon gatherings that Percy Tate Griffith later described in an unpublished biography of Churchward as salons attended by poets and musicians and thinkers. And it was at those meetings that Le Plongeon and his wife Alice had, according to Griffith, led Churchward to his later devotion to the continent of Moo. So Churchward did not invent Moo from scratch. He inherited it from a fading man who had spent his life being laughed at. And then he rebuilt it. He took Le Plongeon's translation, which was already considered wrong by 1890, and he attached it to his own knuckle story. And he turned what had been a single contested reading of a Maya manuscript into a complete civilization, with a geography and a population and a religion and a history. And the books sold. Churchward wrote 5 of them between 1926 and 1935. The Lost Continent of Moo in 1926, The Children of Moo in 1931, The Sacred Symbols of Moo in 1933, Cosmic Forces of Moo in 1934, and the second volume of Cosmic Forces of Moo in 1935. And he kept writing and revising and adding detail until Moo was less a theory and more a world. He passed away in 1936 at the age of 84. And here is the thing about James Churchward that stays with you after you read everything he wrote. He never stopped. 50 years he claimed to have spent on this, and whether the knuckle tablets were real or imagined or something in between, he gave his entire life to a continent that science said could not exist. The archaeologist Stephen Williams, who wrote Fantastic Archaeology in 1991, called Churchward's work pseudoscience, and the science writer Martin Gardner described his books as containing geological and archaeological errors so fundamental that they suggested either deep ignorance or deliberate fabrication. But Gardner also noted that the books kept selling, because the thing about Moo is not whether it is true, The thing about Mu is why people need it to be true, and to understand that you have to go back to the Pacific Ocean, back to that diver in 1986 looking for hammerhead sharks, back to those steps going down into the dark. So let us talk about what a continent actually is, because this matters, and it matters in a specific way. A continent is not just a large piece of land, it is a large piece of a particular kind of rock, and that rock is lighter than the rock of the ocean floor, and it floats on the denser material beneath it, the way a thick slab of wood floats on water. And this is not a theory, it is something we have been able to measure and confirm and map since the 1960s, when the science of plate tectonics became the organizing framework for everything we understand about how the Earth's surface works. And what plate tectonics tells us about Mu is simple, and it is not good for churchward. Geologists Robert S. Dietz and Walter P. Sproul published a paper in the journal Nature in 1970, specifically examining the question of whether a continent could have existed in the Pacific Ocean and sunk, and their conclusion was direct. And they wrote that no sunken continent of the kind described by Churchward or Laplangen is geologically possible in the Pacific Ocean, because the ocean floor there is made of the wrong kind of rock, and has been made of the wrong kind of rock for tens of millions of years, and there is no mechanism by which a continent-sized landmass could sink beneath oceanic crust in the short time required by the Mu hypothesis. So the geology says no, but here is where the story gets more interesting, because the geology saying no does not mean the ocean hid nothing. In 1931, a fishing trawler called the Colinda was working the Dogger Bank in the North Sea between England and what is now Denmark and the Netherlands, and the crew dredged up a lump of peat from the sea floor, and inside that peat was a barbed antler harpoon point, and the peat was later dated to around 11,700 years ago. 11,700 years ago, that part of the North Sea floor was dry land. It had rivers and forests and animals and people, and they left behind harpoon points, and they left behind mammoth fossils and ancient tools. And for 100 years, fishing trawlers in the North Sea have been pulling this material up from the bottom, and it sits in museums across England and Denmark and the Netherlands. And it is not a theory, and it is not a lost civilization from a misread Maya codex. It is physical evidence of a real place that human beings actually lived on, and that is now under 60 meters of water. Researchers today call this place Doggerland, named after the Dogger Bank, and Bryony Coles, a researcher at the University of Exeter, published work in 1998 mapping what Doggerland might have looked like at its greatest extent, and she estimated it was a substantial landmass, possibly as large as Great Britain, stretching across what is now the southern North Sea, and she described it as a rich environment with river valleys and wetlands and coastal areas that would have been attractive to hunter-gatherer populations. And Doggerland did not sink overnight. It was swallowed gradually over several thousand years as the ice sheets of the last ice age melted, and global sea levels rose by something close to 400 feet between about 20,000 years ago and about 7,000 years ago, and the people who lived there had to move as the land retreated, and their stories of what happened to their homeland possibly survived in the oral traditions of their descendants for generations. So there is your real lost land. No 64 million people, no 7 cities, no government of 10 tribes under one religion, but real communities, real hunters, real families who built fires and made tools on land that is now under the North Sea, and who watched that land shrink over generations until it was gone. And Darbyland is not alone. In the Gulf of Kamhat, off the western coast of India, in 2001 and 2002, the National Institute of Ocean Technology was running sonar surveys of the seafloor, and the team found what appeared to be geometric structures at a depth of about 40 meters. And the announcement that followed was significant, because the Indian government described the discovery as possible evidence of a submerged city, older than any known civilization on the Indian subcontinent. Sundaram, a senior scientist at the National Institute of Ocean Technology, told the BBC in January 2002 that the structures appeared to be man-made, and that artifacts recovered from the site, including what appeared to be wood and pottery and traces of those who lived there, had been sent for carbon dating, and that early results suggested the site was around 9,500 years old. 9,500 years old would make it older than the cities of Mesopotamia, older than the earliest phases of the Indus Valley civilization, older than almost everything in the archaeological record of South Asia. But here is a problem with that. Other researchers who examined the sonar data said the formations were natural, and the carbon dating results that Sundaram described were disputed, and the site has never been systematically excavated in the 2 decades since the initial announcement, and the evidence remains contested, and no mainstream archaeologist has accepted the Gulf of Kamhat site as proof of a lost advanced civilization. So we have a real submerged landscape in the North Sea with real artifacts, and a disputed site in India with contested evidence, and both of them are sitting under water, and neither of them is Mu. And then there is Yonaguni. Masahaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyu spent 19 years diving the Yonaguni Monument, and by the mid-1990s he had developed a detailed argument for what he believed he was looking at. And Kimura was specific, and his specificity is what makes his argument worth taking seriously, even if you do not accept his conclusions. Kimura said the monument showed right angles that do not occur naturally in the type of sandstone and mudstone that make up the structure, and he said there was what appeared to be a drainage channel, and a loop road, and a retaining wall, and a flat area he called a stage. And he said he found what appeared to be carvings, including a face that reminded him of the Moai statues of Easter Island, and a shape that from above resembled a turtle. And Kimura published his findings in multiple papers, and he connected the site to Mu. And he argued it had been above water around 10,000 years ago, before the end of the last ice age. And then Robert Schoch arrived. Schoch is a professor of natural sciences at Boston University, and he is the geologist who argued in the early 1990s that the Sphinx at Giza showed weathering patterns suggesting it was older than mainstream Egyptologists believed. And Schoch had experience looking at old stone structures and deciding what was natural and what was not. And Schoch dove Yonaguni and came back with a different answer. Schock wrote in his 2012 book, Forgotten Civilization, that the Yonaguni Monument was in his assessment primarily a natural geological formation, and he described the sandstone and mudstone as having natural bedding planes running horizontally and natural fracture lines running vertically. And he said that when you combine those two features with centuries of wave action and seismic activity, you get exactly the kind of angular stepped structure that people are seeing underwater at Yonaguni. And Takayuki Ogata, a geoscientist at the University of the Ryukyus, pointed out in multiple interviews that on Yonaguni Island itself, above the waterline, there are natural rock formations that look almost identical to the underwater monument. And if the same geological processes can produce those formations above water, there is no reason they could not produce the same formations below it. The general scientific consensus today is that the Yonaguni Monument is a natural formation. Kimura has never accepted that conclusion, and he is still diving, and the debate is not resolved, and that is the honest answer. So where does all of this leave Mu? Plongeon took a real document, the Troano Codex, and read into it something that was not there. Churchward claimed tablets that nobody else ever saw. Kimura spent 19 years on a rock formation that most geologists say nature made without any help, and yet the story keeps going. And the reason the story keeps going is not because people are stupid. In 2019, a team of researchers led by Harold Ringbauer at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published Genetic Analysis of Traces from Ancient Polynesian Populations in the journal Nature, and the results showed patterns of ancestry and migration that suggested ancient Polynesian navigators had reached the coast of South America and mixed with Native American populations around 1200 AD, and then sailed back to Polynesia, carrying that genetic signal with them. The people who crossed the Pacific Ocean were doing things that Western science in 1870 thought were impossible. And in 1976, a man named Nainoa Thompson, who had grown up in Hawaii and had spent years learning traditional Polynesian navigation from a master navigator named Mo Pialug of the Caroline Islands, sailed a traditional double-hulled canoe called the Hakulia from Hawaii to Tahiti, using only stars and ocean swells and wind. No compass, no GPS, no instruments. 2,400 miles. Thompson was 26 years old at the time, and he had spent 3 years learning to read the ocean from Pialag, who later told the Honolulu Advertiser in a 1999 interview that the knowledge of deep ocean navigation had been carried inside Polynesian communities for generations and had never been written down, and that most Western scientists had not believed it was possible because they had not considered what was actually inside the people they were studying. And what the Hakulia voyage proved was not Mu. What it proved was that the Pacific Ocean was a road, and the people who built that road had knowledge and capability that Plongeon and Churchward could not imagine when they were inventing lost continents to explain the connections they were seeing between ancient cultures. The connections are real. The Polynesian cultures and the Maya and the ancient Egyptians do share certain patterns and symbols and stories, and the reason is not a sunken motherland with 64 million inhabitants and 7 cities. The reason is that human beings have been crossing vast stretches of ocean and carrying ideas and technologies with them for a very long time, and that history is more complicated and more impressive than any single origin story. And here is where we leave it. All three of those moments open the same kind of door, the door that opens when we find something under the ground or under the water that we did not expect to find. The plungeon walked through that door and found Mu. Churchward walked through it and found Knuckle. Kimura walked through it and found the same thing. And what is actually behind the door is stranger and more interesting than any of them imagined, because what is behind it is the real history of human beings crossing oceans and losing land to rising seas and carrying knowledge inside themselves across thousands of miles of open water and building things in places we have not looked yet, and the record of all that is still being written, and it is a history that deserves to be remembered. That was the story of Mu Island. A word extracted from a Mayan manuscript in 1876 by a man who was almost certainly mistaken about what he had read, was then passed on to another man who spent 50 years building a continent around it that no one could verify, and was subsequently transmitted to a world that keeps returning to it through 150 years of books, conferences, documentaries, and diving expeditions, and the reason people keep returning to it is neither the tablets nor the geology. It is the fact that Hihachiro Aratake, during a routine dive while searching for sharks, discovered a structure underwater that looked as if it had been made by human hands. Whatever that structure may be, no matter what conclusions geologists ultimately reach regarding the sandstone, the bedding planes, and the fracture lines, the feeling Aratake experienced upon surfacing is one that won't fade easily. Imagine structures that have never been found, perhaps built by other civilizations. The feeling Aratake had upon surfacing, having discovered an undiscovered structure, is an unforgettable sensation. The feeling of discovery. Even if all these stories aren't true, there's this. The least known part of the world is the oceans. We know more about Mars than we do about the ocean floor. Furthermore, beneath these unexplored waters, I believe there are even more things waiting to be discovered. The Plongeon passed away in Brooklyn in 1908, with his theories rejected and his translations dismissed, and his photographs still in the archive, where they remain useful to researchers today. Churchward passed away in 1936 at the age of 84, having written 5 books about a civilization that science said could not exist, and having never found the tablets that started it all. And Masaki Kimura is still diving, and it is late now. And if you have made it this far, you know more about Mu and Doggerland and the Yonaguni Monument and a British colonel who claimed to read a dead language with psychic inspiration than most people will learn in a lifetime of history classes. And that is enough for tonight. Let the story settle. The Pacific is still out there, and the North Sea is still there. And somewhere under the water, the harpoon point that a fisherman dredged up in 1931 came from a life that was real and specific, and gone now for 11,000 years. And that person who made it did not know that either. So let your breathing slow down, let your shoulders drop. Let the ocean do what it does, which is hold everything quietly and give almost nothing back. I hope you enjoyed this episode of History for Sleep, and if you did, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. And if you have questions or thoughts about Mu, or about what you think is actually sitting at the bottom of the Pacific, please leave those in the comments. I read them and I will be happy to respond. And if you know someone who likes falling asleep to forgotten history, please share this with them. And if you would like more episodes like this one, all you need to do is subscribe. Good night.